Hello and welcome. I am Tiffany Marley, the Project Director for the Learning Communities Resource Center here at the National Community Action Partnership. We are glad that you have joined us for today's webinar, Breakthrough Ideas that Move Children and Their Parents Towards Educational Success and Economic Security. Today's agenda will include a time of welcome. Also, during the course of today's webinar, you will have an opportunity to learn more about the two-generation approach. You will hear Garrett County's Community Action Committee stories about culture change, and then also have an opportunity to learn more about two-generation outcomes, and we will conclude with a time of question and answers. So with that said, I want to take a moment to just recognize the Learning Communities Resource Center team here at the partnership. We are indeed a team, and you hear one voice right now, but there are many hands that have been at work that make this kind of learning opportunity happen for our network, and you see their faces on the screen and want to recognize them as contributors to this moment. Also want to invite our attention to the promise of community action, for truly it grounds the conversation that we are holding today, and even as we think about this whole conversation around basically the moving children and parents forward, we are very much focused on this theory that when services are integrated to meet the needs of parents and children together, efficiency is improved and outcomes are enhanced for parents, children, and families. And so as we think about our notion of the whole family approach and just what it means to effectively engage in the two-generation approach, that very much informs our thinking from the partnership perspective, and really we feel that this promise of community action also serves as important grounding as we think about moving children and families forward. And that promise, it says that community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we're dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. And so with that said, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you two very important colleagues to today's conversation, one being Marjorie Sims. Marjorie serves as the Managing Director at Ascend at the Aspen Institute, and really very much has internalized and embodied this message of the two-generation approach for the field, for that matter. And so we're excited, Marjorie, that you are here with us.
Thank you.
And also want to go ahead and introduce Gregan Crawford, whom you will hear from later in today's presentation. Gregan is the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Garrett County Community Action Committee Incorporated in, I think it's Oakland, Maryland. And there again, Garrett County, as we like to call them, have really been pace setters and champions within our network around what it means to think about engaging in the two-generation or the whole family approach, but not only thinking about it, beginning to implement that in an effective manner. And so with that said, Marjorie, I'm going to hand the baton over to you to lead our conversation today. Thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tiffany. And welcome, everyone. It is truly my delight to be here presenting on this webinar. Have such deep respect for the Community Action Partnership, the work that you all are doing in communities to strengthen families and communities. So this webinar, as Tiffany mentioned, we will be covering the two-generation approach, and I'm also delighted to have Gregan participate so that he can give you real-life examples of the work that they're doing in Garrett County to move forward a two-generation approach. So just first, a little bit about Ascend at the Aspen Institute. We are a policy program of the Aspen Institute and have been a policy program for almost 8 years now. Our real goal is to help programs, practitioners, policymakers, do work more effectively to have better outcomes for families. More specifically, to move families up the economic ladder so that they are financially independent. That is our North Star. We focus on helping programs and practitioners and policymakers really understand how to serve families more holistically through a two-generation approach. So we convene people on a regular basis to learn about the approach, look at opportunities and strategies. We also have a fellowship program in which we identify leaders across the country that are engaged in two-generation approaches, to provide them an experience over 18 months to deepen their work doing two-generation. And then finally, we see our role as providing lots of resources and tools, identifying those solutions that, help deepen the two-generation approach at the national level, and working very closely with states and communities as two-generation approaches get deeper and deeper across the country. So that's a little bit about Ascend, and I'm going to turn it over to Gregan now so that he can share about community action work in Garrett County. So Gregan.
Garrett County Community Action was founded in 1965. We now employ 185 people, and we offer about 42 to 45 different programs and services, from everything from aging and nutrition to early Head Start and Head Start, child care, asset development, public transit, affordable housing. So we cover the full spectrum in our county. We're a rural county located in the far western reaches of western Maryland, and our population is about 29,500. We serve about 1 in 3 households in the county. There are about 12,000 households, and we serve about 1 in 4 county residents. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Marjorie.
Thank you, Gregan. And Garrett County is recognized across the country as one of the leading two-generation programs, and it's a delight, again, to have Gregan participate in this webinar and share the work that they're doing. So a little bit about the two-generation approach, just what it is more specifically on, a high level. The two-generation approach, we define it as, opportunities that provide, strategies and goals that meet the needs of both children and their parents together, so simultaneously. And we share this particular continuum, often when we do presentations, because it allows programmers and practitioners as well as policymakers to think about how programs are shaped in communities. So on one side, you see, child-focused programs, and then on the opposite end, you see adult-focused programs, and some examples of those that, come closer. But the goal, again, of a two-generation approach is to serve families holistically, serving both children and their parents together. So I think we're going to now take a little bit of a pause so that you can think about how your program work lands on a two-generation continuum.
Yes, and so we would like to invite you all to utilize your chat window at this time and write the name of your agency and then answer the following question. Where is your work on the two-generation continuum? Where is it? Is it more child-focused with parent element, whole family, parent-focused with child element, or parent-focused? So at this time, if you very quickly utilize the chat window and send to everyone so we can all see your responses, we would appreciate it. Thank you. responses coming in. Thank you so much. There looks to be a mixture of responses.
And that often is the case, that in groups, some folks are doing whole family work, and then some, are a little bit more child-focused with some parent elements, and then others that have a higher leaning towards adult-focused programs. Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Really interesting, really interesting. And, I'm sure a lot of the focus, has emerged over the years in communities, but let me move on to just a little bit about the history of the two-generation approach. So two-generation this term was coined in the mid-90s, but the concept itself, serving families holistically, does have a long and rich history. As you see here on this particular slide, in the late 1800s, through the settlement house movement, when immigrant families were moving into communities, those communities really wanted to serve the entire family, not just simply, one individual in the family, but making certain that the entire family moved forward. So that is embedded in the settlement house movement of the late 1800s. And then move forward in the 1960s as part of the War on Poverty, the founding for your programs was also the Head Start program. And so Head Start in its inception was very much about providing early childhood education to young children and then helping the parent, and typically this was a single mom, gain the skills needed to engage in the workforce, stay in the workforce, and then, succeed in the workforce. So really looking at how the entire family could be, better off economically and in terms of educational attainment as well. And then in the 1970s and 80s, there's the family resource efforts. They're across the country, often named, family success centers or family resource centers or family empowerment centers or financial independence centers. But again, these efforts very much are about, providing holistic support to the family, both children and adults together. And then, as I said earlier, the term two-generation was actually coined in the mid-90s by the Foundation for Child Development, and that was an effort that they were undertaking very specifically to look at a set of programs that had started, to add parent elements to child funding programs. And so in 1996, there was an evaluation by St. Pierre and some other experts looking at these programs, and that's where we have a body of research that indicates, really what does make successful for a two-generation effort. And I want to go to the next slide just to show you, the list of those programs that were evaluated. And so you see them here. Some of them are still very much in operation today, but all of these programs in this evaluation, were focused first primarily on providing early child care education to young children and then adding some parent elements. And what was learned through the evaluation of these programs is that, the parent elements, those, efforts to really improve outcomes for the parents were not as successful or not as strong as those efforts that those programs were doing for children. And so what we've learned, from two-generation, 1.0 is what we call it, this earlier iteration, is that making certain that there is, intentional service integration and that it cannot be simply, adding on elements that are, short in term. It has to be intense, it has to be intentional. The quality of programs really matters. Early childhood programs, the higher quality that they are, the more likelihood you will have for successful, educational attainment, for the children. And then also, I mentioned this, that intensity is very important. And then also who you target is important. How do you assess, families in your community to make certain that you're providing the right services to the right target population when it is needed. And then finally, how you work with families matters. Making certain that they have a true voice, at the table is very, very important. So as, this research, landed in the mid, 1990s, two-generation programs, quite frankly, fell out of favor because, as you may know, at the same time, welfare reform conversations were taking place, and that became, really the focus of how you help, families, move forward by, receiving job training and placement in jobs. So two-generation kind of went silent, at the national level, at the discourse level for those two reasons. The outcomes for, parents in those programs weren't as strong as, people had hoped, and then there was a new conversation about welfare reform. So, we're moving forward, recognizing the importance of those lessons that were learned through that research. So why two-generation now? What, has really occurred over a number of years is siloing of programs because of the fact that, federal funding streams are huge drivers for programs at the state level and at the community level. You have child-focused funding streams, you have youth-focused funding streams, and you also have adult-focused funding streams. And those are very, very separate, at the federal level, at the state level, and within communities. But the recognition, and this has been inherent for a long time, that when you serve the family holistically, moving forward both the children and the adults together, you will have better and stronger outcomes. So next slide, please. So recognizing, the research and, the way that funding streams are, driving the design of programs, when Ascend was started and in conversation with, our fellows and practitioners, policymakers across the country, really established a set of core principles for doing two-generation work. This is an approach first and foremost, but all of this work has to be grounded, regardless of where you start, about, how intentional you are about your work and what the principles or values are. So the first one is, very important for doing two-generation work, and that's, measuring, and accounting for outcomes for both children and adults together. If you're doing two-generation work at its most deepest level, you really are holding, the family's goals, interests, and outcomes very, very closely and measuring for, success for those families. The other, principles here, you'll probably recognize they're really great principles for any specific program. If you want to succeed, you want to make certain that you're, making certain that the programs are ensuring equity in your community, that you're engaging the voices, of families from the beginning of, the design of the programs, the implementation, the assessment of the program. And you want to make certain that you're utilizing all the financial resources in a way that they're being aligned and linked, and making services, accessible for families. And then, just really re-emphasizing here again that what distinguishes these principles from other very strong principles and, and other programs or policies is the first one, measuring and accounting for outcomes for both children and their, parents together. So the next slide is what are the core components of doing two-generation work. And you'll see here that, you know, working with families, these are what they need to very much succeed. Families need, you know, quality early childhood education. Parents need, you know, post-secondary opportunities and employment pathways. They need access to, you know, asset development strategies. And they also need, you know, access to, you know, health and well-being services and supports. And you'll see all of those reflected here. The one that I will pull out more specifically, and we call this the secret sauce of doing two-generation work, and that's social capital. And that is a very intentional, you know, program design in which you are building, you know, that network of families, you know, their ability to navigate both formal and informal systems, your bridging and your bonding. You know, Ascend at the Aspen Institute, we've done a lot of, you know, focus groups over the years, you know, to really understand the opportunities for families, how they feel about programs, and within those focus groups, and it's been consistent, you know, over an 8-year period, is that families that are low income often feel very, very isolated in their communities. Sometimes they don't even trust their neighbors to, you know, provide child care. And so programs and policies that really have at their heart, you know, an opportunity to build a social capital, we believe will be much more successful than other programs. So I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany now because we're going to take another pause for a chat.
Yes, and so you're going to utilize that chat window again, provide the name of your agency, and this time here is the question. So Marjorie has just talked about those core components of the two-generation approach. Which ones does your agency currently address? Which of the core components of a two-generation approach do you address? Respond, and so you have your choices. She's talked about that secret sauce being social capital, health and well-being, economic assets, employment, post-secondary and employment pathways, early childhood education. Which ones are you currently engaging?
And you may be engaging in all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 weeks ago when I was doing a presentation, I got a really interesting question about doing two-generation work, and it was whether or not you could actually do two-generation work within one of the core components without doing all the others. And I would say, and this was my answer then, that you can because remember it's about serving both parents and adults together and making certain that you're at least aware of the needs, but having that social capital component within any of these structures is really important. So we are looking at the screen and some things are coming up. All aspects of the core components. Great. And I guess that's probably very inherent to most community action agencies, right? That you're serving families very holistically. I'm curious about how people are doing on the social capital piece, but we can come back to that during the Q&A. So the next slide. This is the two-generation approach continuum, and this is really an important concept to understand when doing two-generation work because it happens along a continuum. You know, earlier when I was introducing, you know, the work at Ascend, I said that we advocate for a two-generation approach. And taking the approach simply means having the mindset of understanding that, you know, children live within families, parents care about, you know, where their children are, there's this, you know, inherent bond that exists. and how do you recognize that? So if you're a child, facing program, do you simply know whether or not your parents, are working, if they have, economic needs? That doesn't mean that you're going to address those needs, but you're just, trying to take into consideration what are the dynamics within your family that you're serving, right? And then you can have a two-generation strategy. And that means that, as a program working in community, you're building partnerships in a real strong way to make certain that your families are, meeting, their goals by receiving access to programs and other services within the community. So that's a two-generation strategy. Ascend has a national network across the country of about 250 organizations and associations, and I would say the vast majority of those within our network are doing a two-generation strategy. The highest level of doing two-generation work is a two-generation organization, and that means that within your entire organization, you have taken the time to be really intentional about building the internal systems and culture and structure to make certain that you can serve families holistically. And then you're providing services for both children and the adults, and then you're actually collecting, data to see how far your families are moving based on the services that you're providing or, partners within your community are providing. But you're really tracking outcomes for the entire family as opposed to, if you have a Head Start program, you're tracking, outcomes for children and reporting them, but for the parents you may be giving them referral services, but you're not tracking their outcomes and you're not tracking the family outcomes. So it's important to know as an organization, as an agency, where your strengths may lie in a two-generation continuum, and then focusing where you would like to, land. And as I said, most of the programs that, we work with are doing two-generation strategies because it has to be really intentional. You have to be on a path to doing deep, intensive two-generation work. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Gregan because Garrett County happens to be one of those organizations within our network that we would really define as a two-generation organization. And so I'm going to turn it over to Gregan. He's going to share with you their journey of doing two-generation work. So, Gregan.
Thank you, Marjorie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gregan Crawford. I'm the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at Garrett County. And you can see my contact information there, so please always feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions in the future about our two-generation work. I am going to talk a little bit about our journey and what we've learned along the way and about the elements of our two-generation approach. For context, our two-generation population is our Head Start and our early Head Start families. We operate 9 centers around the county for Head Start and early Head Start. And that population numbers about 300 families. They're predominantly two-parent families or single-mother families. They're in their mid-20s. The parents have about 1 to 2 children on average. They predominantly rent rather than own a home, and most are working. If you could go to the next slide, please. So where did we begin? The organization began to shift when the strategic plan was drafted and adopted in about 2009, 2010. And what was realized in that planning process was that the organization was very successful in running programs, and that the staff really identified themselves as running a program. So we were deeply siloed, is what it told us. We were really great at generating head counts and enrollments, but we simply couldn't tell, or at least deeply understand, the extent that those programs made a difference or helped a family to become more economically secure, or did those programs create lasting outcomes to fulfill a family's aspirations and needs. So we were siloed, and we began to think how we can change to become a more outcomes-based organization. And that strategic plan provided us with a new trajectory, and we began a very comprehensive overhaul of the organization in terms of our corporate culture and our service model for delivery. And at that time, we really had no idea of what the extent of the change was going to be, what was to come. We really didn't have a name for it. We weren't really aware of the two-generation approach concept, and so we just started in trying to pioneer a new way to deliver that service and to help our families. But with the help of the Annie Casey Foundation and Ascend, we were able to work and move in a deliberate manner towards what has become our two-generation approach. And in order to fulfill that strategic plan, we began to identify those strengths and gaps, and we began to examine that corporate culture, and we began a 12-month pilot with families and individuals. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So in order to form that pilot group for the first year, we chose about 12 families, and we asked our frontline staff to identify and approach individuals and families who they served and who they knew had aspirations or a desire to better their situation and circumstances. And you can see what we've learned there's above in the bullet points. And over that course of the year, we regularly met on a monthly basis to try to understand and devise a frame for a better method of delivering those services and to begin to measure the outcomes that could better enable that pilot group to reach their goals. And in short, we began to discover the value of bundling services and the value of providing seamless service integration. We knew that that was a direction we also wanted to move in after a year. We also discovered that the corporate culture needed to change, and we needed to embrace the idea that we were one agency with one mission and move away from the siloed aspect of just running a really great program. So to do that, we took the agency, to use an image, and we just turned it upside down like a snow globe and started to reorganize things. Offices were moved so that clients would have better access to the services, so that the staff could begin to cross-coordinate and they could learn, our staff could learn what, the folks at the other end of the hall did. And we really strove to break down those silos, and we've tried to work hard over the ensuing years to keep those silos tamped down. More information across those departments began to get shared. Our frontline staff, we set up monthly meetings for our coordinators, as were our caseworkers, and so they could exchange ideas. As we collected more data, we started to have regular data manager meetings, contract and data manager meetings. We also, as we started to develop and define our outcomes, we started to form an outcomes committee and started to track those meetings, and we also, those outcomes rather, and we also set up a communications task force so that we could learn to better communicate within the agency. We learned that our clients had aspirations and needs, and that we needed to develop the capacity to serve those needs related to financial literacy and career and educational aspirations. So some of that capacity we could develop internally, and that which we couldn't develop internally, we had to look to our community partners to provide, such as the community college, the health department, and the Department of Social Services. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So this slide illustrates how we began to define what was becoming our 2G framework. You can see the various elements of our organizational cultural change and our partners, as well as the role of social capital. The organizational changes were deep and wide. We went from about 100 different job descriptions down to 14. We became more oriented digitally, and work plans and performance evaluations for staff became electronic, and were they became linked to fulfilling the objectives and the goals of the strategic plan. So everybody got a new job description. Nobody moved backwards in pay. That was also a galvanizing element to move towards, one mission, one agency. And we began to transition from a casework model to a coaching model. The Crisis to Thrive scale for families to conduct their self-assessments was implemented, and that assessment helps to foster a conversation about their aspirational goals and provides a snapshot of where they are and helps to foster that discussion, too, about developing a pathway plan, which outlines their goals and the action steps that need to be taken towards them. The role of technology and software was an element that we couldn't overlook, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But I'd like to highlight the establishment of the career coach and career ladder services with our community college. And just talking about partnerships, the college has traditionally been focused on workforce development, and rather reinvent the wheel, we established the career coach position with the college. It took about 1.5 years to establish. We had to find some funding for it. It was a 50-50 salary split, and our coach could work with the college's tools for skill assessment, aptitude testing, GED classes, and this helped us to work towards, fulfilling that idea of seamless service integration for our clients. Once we began to work with the Department of Social Services, we realized that closer coordination was long overdue, as we had about a 75% overlap in clients. And the Department of Social Services picked up on that, and they've been a strong advocate of the two-generational work and serving the common customer, as they say. With all of our partners, too, we operate under a formalized MOU. You can go to the next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about our theory of change, which works along the 3 channels that you see on the slide. It centers on better assisting those we serve by enabling opportunity and building capacity internally and externally in the community. And there's some underlying assumptions that underpin our theory of change, and a couple examples are, if adults improve their job readiness skills and/or their technical skills and knowledge, that employers will be willing and able to hire them at better wages. Another example of some of the assumptions that we made is, achieving small steps and having someone who believes in them can improve the confidence of parents. And there's a whole page of notes. I think that we can, hopefully I can get those posted too, or you can contact me, and talks a little bit more about our assumptions and our thought process in the theory of change development. If you go to the next slide, you can see our logic model. And this is just our theory of change in action. The logic model, this is the logic model that's used in our 2G work. The inputs and core services and outputs reflect the possible service bundles that help a family to move to the outcomes, whether they're short-term, intermediate, or long-term in nature. You can move to the next slide if you'd like. And back to the management information systems, I played a key role in helping the agency, to become more outcomes focused. When we started this journey in 2009, about 1 year into it, we realized in order to support that corporate change and our service delivery model that MIS was going to play a large role in that. And it took a little time. It took about 3 or 4 years to get our computers upgraded, get a server established. We had some computers were brand new in the agency, some were years old, some had older software, newer software, different platforms. So we had to get that all standardized throughout the agency. We shifted to a more paperless agency, created an intranet, an electronic, a digital management form. and work plans became electronic, so everything was linked electronically. We have centers throughout the county, so it was very important to get everybody up to speed and everybody on the same level playing field. And we had to establish a replacement protocol, so on a yearly basis, we continue to roll over and upgrade our MIS and our PCs. Perhaps that was the most significant element in developing our 2G-based system, is that one centralized intake was allowed to occur. We could move to no wrong door, universal intake, and the presumptive eligibility. Those are just key underpinnings of our 2G programming. So to do that, we had to have the capacity of the management information systems to support that. And this also allowed our staff to access and interact with the system a little more, helped to galvanize the agency, again, back to the one mission, one agency concept. We were able to better capture accurate data and draw upon the data from one singular database. We maintain one file on our families, and that reduces the chance for error. It took about a year and a half to clean up our data. If you've had multiple programs, you had multiple databases in the past, and you've got multiple chances for errors, and that was true with us, with just misspellings, addresses that were incorrect. A lot of things needed to be updated. So we now have in place data quality and data contract managers who keep our system current with eligibility protocols for different programs, and they also ensure that our data fields are filled out and we're capturing the information. So that's helped us to make more informed decisions about our operations. It helps us to monitor and track the progress and the outcomes of our clients. It also helps us to begin to look at correlations in our data, and it helps to foster conversations now about community outcomes and working with our partners. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So this is just a summary graphic of how we've changed over the last 9 years. We like to say that this is now how we do business. Our frontline staff have been trained in a coaching model, and the ability to build that long-term relationship between our frontline staff and our participants is vital to everybody's success. We've worked to move the burden of success off of families and participants and onto the programs that are supposed to serve them. And we strive to implement the seamless integration with the bundling of services through partnerships. This goes back to having the ability to have universal intake and the determination of presumptive eligibility. And lastly, we want to measure and track the outcomes that we create. And we wanted to shift when we had that strategic plan rewrite in 2009. We knew then that we wanted to become a more results and outcome-oriented agency. So this is the way we do business now. It's been a journey of continuous learning and change. It's been changed so that it's been instrumental in helping our families to achieve their aspirations and that greater level of economic security. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Marjorie. And happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much, Greg. And that was a very impressive presentation of the work that you all have been doing. And before, I go on to this next section in which we'll be talking about outcomes, Gregan, can you just share with us a little bit about how long you've been on this journey of doing a two-generation approach?
Oh, it started in about 2009 when we redid our strategic plan. We did the one-year pilot to about 2010, and then we just slowly kept taking a bite of the apple and moving in that direction of defining our outcomes and working with our families. We've been at this now for about 9 years, and I think it's just a continuous journey of improvement and and getting better and helping our families.
Great, thank you so much. And I wanted you to share that because, I wanted everyone to have a sense of, how long you've been on this journey, and that you had stated that it actually has been, longer than, Ascend at the Aspen Institute has been, in existence. And so just to recognize that in communities, and your communities that you all are, working in, this notion of serving, families holistically is really intuitive and inherent, but what it takes to do this very, very well is, a path and a journey, very much like, Garrett County has been on, is to really look at, internally, what are the systems and structures that may need to be rethought to make certain that families are served holistically. So for this section is, what is a two-generation outcome? And I always put this up when I'm doing these presentations about outcomes and, learnings and creating tools that will help you assess outcomes for families, is because, when I first started at Ascend about 3.5 years ago, I, had the pleasure of facilitating a conversation with some practitioners who were just starting, to work on two-generation approaches in their communities. And someone asked the question, what's a two-generation outcome? And no one in the room, and I had just started, I was 3 days into my job, and no one in the room could answer that question. And so Ascend went on a, 6-month journey with a small group of practitioners, researchers, and a few policymakers to really clarify for the field what a two-generation outcome is. And in fact, there is no such thing as a two-generation outcome. They're outcomes for two-generation programs. And I want to emphasize that they're outcomes for programs and policies that are aiming at a two-generation approach. So how you assess those outcomes. But all of the outcomes that you will identify for your families, for your systems change, will be based on research and knowledge that's already out there. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to share with you a couple of tools that we've developed, that are available on our website, and, you can download them, access them, easily. But these two reports, one, Making Tomorrow Better Together, which is a report of the Two-Generation Outcomes Working Group, and the second one, which is a complement to that first one, Making Tomorrow Better Together, a guide for outcomes for two-generation policymakers. So when I said that we had gone on, Ascend had gone on this journey with, a group of practitioners and policymakers and researchers to really think about, answer the question that was posed 3 years ago as this field was just emerging, what's a two-generation, outcome. That working group, working together, was seeking to answer that question. And what we landed on are a set of outcomes that are based on what are strong outcomes for children, what are strong outcomes for young people, what are strong outcomes for adults, and what are strong outcomes for families. All of those outcomes are probably outcomes that you're seeking already for your families. For example, for, a child, it may be, meeting a developmental milestone, reading at grade level. Or for an adult, it might be, getting a job, or, retaining that a job over a period of time, increased wages, increased assets. Those outcomes are based in research and knowledge that's already existing. Programs across the country are using, those outcomes, to assess their two-generation programs. And then also, that research is really based in, strategy and, learning over a number of years. So just know that when you design your outcomes framework for taking a two-generation approach, you know, the outcomes that you should be identifying for your program are ones that are unique to children, to young people, to adults, and then to the entire family. And I can go into some more specific examples in a second. But in the next slide, I want to show you a sample theory of change. Now, Gregan shared with you the theory of change that they use for Garrett County and the work that they're doing, and you noticed it was on one page. This theory of change also is on one page, but what this takes, and this is more of a graphic representation of what a theory of change might be, but what's underneath this is very deep thinking and strategy discussion about how an organization, a program, really wants to do their two-generation work and where are they headed. I think Gregan was very, very generous, and Garrett County is very generous in sharing their learnings and knowledge, and he said that, you know, they have a lot of, you know, assessments and assumptions that underlie their theory of change and their logic model that, you know, he's happy to share with you. But for this particular logic model, if you start on the left, you know, it's looking at, you know, different, you know, family structures, and then if those families, you know, have access to, you know, the core components, you know, over a period of time, they then will, you know, have successful outcomes, a better, stronger family, you know, better educational attainment and economic status, and a stronger community. And what we advocate when you're developing a theory of change, make certain that it's time-bound. Exactly when do you think that these goals, you know, will be met? And, you know, if you have some time frame, and this, you know, sample theory of change was developed a couple of years ago, but, you know, at that time we said by, you know, 2018, we would expect to see, you know, some of these outcomes for family, these successful outcomes for families. But that's, you know, just a sample theory of change. Again, you know, it looks simple, but it is complex in the way that you get to that level of clarity. So the next slide is a sample logic model, and this really does reflect this logic model structure that Gregan had shared with you. So what you're looking at is, you know, first identifying who the target population is, you know, what their goals and needs are, what are your inputs, your outputs, you know, and then your short-term outcomes, your midterm outcomes, and then your long-term outcomes. And the length of, you know, time frames that you know, would identify are based on your program and what you think might be achievable in that time frame. How would you define short-term for your families? How would you define midterm for your families? And how would you define long-term for families, right? And so at the top, you have, you know, the adult, you know, focus, goals, interventions, and then you have this mutual motivation factor, what are the family goals, and then at the bottom, you'll have the child, you know, goals, interventions, and then what are some of the outcomes based on time frames for each one of those. So this is, you know, just the sample template. We have this, you know, in a Word document where you could actually fill it in and work on it. What we do say about logic models is that they're living and breathing documents. You don't create it and put it on a shelf. You create it and revisit it constantly to make certain that, you know, you are gathering input from your families about what their goals are, you know, tracking how they're doing, making certain that they're on a path to success, and then you're refining your program as you go along. As, you know, Gregan had, you know, shared with you, this is a journey, and they are constantly iterating on it. So this is the template that's accessible to anyone. The next slide, is a sample logic model, very much like what Garrett County has developed for their work to really show you, what might be some of the different types of inputs you might have or outputs in activities, just to give you an example of what something might look like, and just alongside what Gregan had shared with you, just another example. And then in the next slide, you have an illustration of how we think it's best to fill this template out. First, think about who you're serving, and then think about what are their long-term outcomes. What is the success that you hope for your families? And then you would go back to thinking about your activities and the services that you're providing, and then, based on, that, what are some of the family, outcomes and activities that you're thinking about, and then making certain that you're more diligent about what are those outputs for both adults and children, what are the short-term and then medium-term outcomes that will lead to your longer-term outcomes. I think, the way that this is framed and the way that you can start to think about it, it's both, identifying who in your community you want to serve, who you are serving, and then really what's your vision? What are your goals, working with your families, for your programmatic outcomes. So that's the template and how to fill it out. Again, these resources are available on our website. Tiffany shared them with you, via email. And then, start to have conversations with your team about, what you might already have in place that, will be able to be inserted here, and what do you need to do to really make, ways to strengthen both your theory of change and your logic model. So here we're, again, going to take a pause so that we can hear a little bit from you and make certain that we're headed in the right direction around your thinking about outcomes.
And so often we have said, as you begin, think about the end, or keep the end in mind, and really this exercise helps you to do that. And so you're going to utilize the chat window, again, giving us the name of your agency, and we just want you to answer the first question just to get your juices flowing, and it is, what outcomes are you seeking for children and the adults in their lives? And so if you want to think about it, on the various levels that have been mentioned in terms of short-term, medium-term, or long-term, that's fine. You could do it that way, or you could just write what comes to mind, because really we just want you to think about it and to sort of begin this process, and then we can go from there. So using that chat window, if you haven't started to just share with us what those outcomes are you are seeking for children and the adults in their lives. And this is not a trick question.
It's more about what's your vision for your families, right? I often, interchange vision with outcomes. Outcomes obviously are, something that are very, very measurable. You can track them, but they're also visionary, right? What do your families seek? And you may have already identified, strong outcomes for your program. Do we see financial self-sufficiency? Awesome.
We'd love to hear from some more of you. Give it a try. Okay, got some more in there, Marjorie.
school ready. That's awesome. Increased educational, can't see that word.
Okay, so increased education amongst children and parents, earning higher wages among adults is another one.
Great.
And let's see another one. For adults, it is employment that offers a career with income growth and career advancement. For children, it's improving their educational or education success and experiences. Some outcomes might include cultural exposure.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. So grounded in culture. That's great.
And then this one is for children. Let's see.
That are school ready both through education
and emotionally.
Oh, social emotional attainment. That's great. Thank you for sharing those. Very impressive. Great. Permanent housing. All services now. That's great. Thank you for sharing them. Very, very nice. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so for the next couple of slides, these are just really resources for you. I'd mentioned that within the very first publication, Making Tomorrow Better Together, there in the back, there are templates that share with you what are some possible outcomes that you may be thinking about within your program. So this is the first one around educational success. And the broader outcome would be the child is ready for school and takes charge of his or her learning. And then more specific to that is meets developmental milestones is one that I had mentioned earlier. But the real beauty of this table is that you can see what research supports those specific types of outcomes under all of those that have been listed and what are important. And then we also, and this is broken down both by the core components and then also children and adults within that publication. And the second publication that I mentioned around outcomes for two-generation policymakers and systems change, that also has outcomes identified for those types of changes in policy work. And then finally, all of the outcomes that are in both publications are actually housed in a portal that's on the Ascend website that is the Outcomes Bank for Two-Generation Programs. It's interactive. You can actually go online and submit outcomes that you are using so that you can engage with other, peers across the country, or you can look at the Outcomes Bank, sort through them, identify and link to the research behind those specific outcomes, and also look to see what other programs across the country may be using those outcomes in case you would like to be connected with them to get some more learning and understanding about, how they really are tracking those specific outcomes. So these resources, both the two publications, the tools that are within them, the theory of change, the logic model, and the online outcomes bank really are, tools that set up, a way in which you can think about an outcomes framework for two-generation programs and the work that you're doing. And, that, kind of concludes my formal comments. But, you know, I want to just go back to, you know, a lot of the things that I heard from Gregan's presentation and the demonstration of what's most important in doing two-generation work, and that's leadership as well as culture change within organizations. You all are leaders working, you know, in communities for, you know, on behalf of families. And so this work, I know, is important to you, and you're committed to better outcomes for families. And this is, you know, a strategy that will help you get there. So, you know, I appreciate the opportunity to present on the webinar. Thank you so much, Tiffany, and the rest of the CAP staff. It's been just a delight, you know, to be engaged. So I think we're going to open it up for questions then.
Thank you very much, Marjorie, and thank you, Gregan, for those important insights. And so we do see that some questions have started to come through the chat, and we're going to start with you, Gregan. There's a question that has come through. Your colleagues would like to know about the database that you use, or maybe talk about how to talk about the database, or just talk about data in relation to implementation.
So I can do that. So we use a system called Empower by CSST, and that allows us, it's a customizable platform, it's web-based, and that allows for us to input the eligibility, program eligibility criteria and maintain it, and it also allows for some crosswalks to be created. It allows us to exchange some data. We generate funder reports from it, our CSBG reports. We use it to track how our progress on our strategic goals. So we have a report that we call the Outcomes Report, and it has our 5 strategic goals and then 24 strategies, about 100 indicators across the agency, and a lot of the numbers that get pulled for that report come from how we track our data. You know, at one point we had about 30 different databases, and really none of them could talk to each other. So it was just imperative to have a system where across the board everything could be inputted into one database and one system. So the contract data managers and quality managers meet on a monthly basis to talk about reports that they need or glitches that need to be resolved in the system. And that's about it. I mean, I can go on, but I'll stop there.
Okay. So there's a question for us to go back to the slide on measurable outcomes. So we're going to head in that direction. And also there was a question about whether or not the slides would be available after today's webinar. And we will be emailing you all with that information. It will also be available on the partnership website. And then the follow-up question for you, Gregan, is how did Garrett County get leadership to buy in to the 2-gen organizational restructure?
That's a great question. That is a great question. It is about leadership.
Well, you know, it was consistent messaging that this is the way we're going to do business. This is the way we do business now. We also were able to engage the services of Paige Teagarden. And if you know Paige Teagarden, once she's on a task, look out. She's just a whirlwind. So we had an internal element to drive the change over the course of those 5, 6, 7 years, and that was Paige Teagarden. Can't say enough good things about her and what she was able to accomplish from the strategic plan forward. So we had that internal driver.
But the other thing that, Gregan, clarify if I'm incorrect, but leadership of your agency is the one that, you know, really took this on. So it wasn't a matter of, you know, other staff, right? Other staff were on board, but leadership was on board initially.
Correct. I mean, they had the support of the board of directors. When they did the strategic plan, it was kind of an aha moment, a revelation that this is the direction we need to move in. The staff who didn't support it slowly attritioned out. If they didn't kind of convert to a new way of thinking and a new approach, you know, they just attritioned out along the way. And so now with new staff coming into the agency, most of them don't know any other way to deliver services but this model.
Yeah, so then there's yet another follow-up question about the database, and it is, can it easily import data from other databases? And I know that there's a whole conversation around that. Would you like to speak to that? And because it certainly relates to the database that you all utilize at Garrett, but I think there's a broader conversation that impacts the database regardless of what it is for an agency engaging in this approach. Can you speak to that, Gregan?
To some degree. I mean, we've tried to encourage the state to move in our direction, and so we have created some forms that mirror state forms that allow for us to take that information, the intake information, and then process it on to the state, like the LIHEAP application. You know, we can do a crosswalk from our public transit. We're working on a crosswalk from our public transit data into Empower so that we can track the number of rides and the customers and how they utilize that service and how that becomes a bundled element in their delivery of services.
All right. Thank you very much. And so someone has written in the chat, for example, the homeless management info systems. And I know, Greg, and what I was alluding to is, you know, this larger conversation that we're having around data standards and, you know, what it means. Sort of, you know, think about that internally and then also talk about that externally so that the transition is a more intuitive transition across programs and systems.
Well, we were able to engage in a pilot study of kind of data definitions and the ability to place data into a data bank and how can you create greater data interoperability, so a CADIO project. And so as data gets used and kind of moved up the chain of review, you know, the data that is looked at on a local level is non-anonymized, and you can see who they are, but different people, different places or different levels of evaluation need different data, but it all needs to be aggregated. And so if you're collecting data with a system in New Mexico and we collect it here under another system, how can we dump the same data into a data bank and have researchers or policymakers draw out of that data bank? I mean, I think that's the next frontier of how we can accomplish that.
All right. Thank you so much. So that looks like the last bit of questions. Is there a final word that either of you would like to have at this time?
So this is Marjorie, and I would just like to, again, say thank you so much for inviting us in to participate in the webinar. I'm very, very impressed with the work that you all are doing, and, you know, hope that, you know, if you have questions or requests, you know, please be in touch. And thank you, Gregan.
Well, thank you, Marjorie and Tiffany, for the opportunity to participate, and we like to share anything that we've learned so that people have shorter learning curves.
Well, thank you as well to both of you and to everyone who joined us today. So the work continues, and so we promise to share today's recording and the slides with you today. Also, we'd like for you to just take a quick moment just to reflect on what was presented during today's meeting, and if you would just give a gift back to your peers and to us who put on today's webinar to tell us one thing that you learned. Just utilizing the chat window, we'll just take about a half a minute to do that. And as you're doing that, I just want to affirm that this work that we are talking about is good work. It's hard work, but it's good work because at the end of the day, we truly do want families to succeed. And certainly our wonderful colleagues at Ascend deeply believe in that, and certainly we within the Community Action Network believe in that too. And so we thank you very much for joining with us, and we'll point your attention very quickly to some announcements about upcoming Webinar Wednesdays. Today's presentation was a Webinar Wednesday presentation, also a part of the knowledge building process for our Community Action Economic Mobility initiative or project, where we have several learning community groups that are focused on implementing a whole family approach and implementing service integration. And so in addition to that, there are various webinars that are coming up across our focus areas within the learning community. So please take advantage of those. They are welcome to you. Finally, we'd like to hear from you about how today's webinar went. And so if you take a few minutes just to click on the SurveyMonkey link and offer us your feedback, we would greatly appreciate it. And then in conclusion, I would be remiss without pointing out the team here at the partnership, at the National Community Action Partnership. We are all a part of the training and technical assistance team. So if you have a question of any of us related to your needs, related to anything we discussed today or any other training need, we are here for you. So thank you, and this concludes today's discussion. Make it a great day.